Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
And today we are going to join the rest of the country in reveling in the idea of the shithole. We are going to probe this archetype. We are going to spelunk its deep meanings and get our sleeves rolled up and plunge in to the whole idea of the shit and the shithole, which is appearing everywhere, a word that normally is not used in polite society. We're turning on the television, newscasters are saying shithole, people are embarrassed about it, but they can't seem to stop saying it. So what is it about the idea of the shithole that we just can't move beyond?
Partly, I think it's everyone has caught on to this phrase because the President of the United States said it, and said it about African countries and our geographic neighbor Haiti. And it is such a shock to hear not only the language, but the horrible sort of pejorative, if I may, feeling about these things, that people are jolted by it. And in some peculiar way, it seems to have legitimized the use of this word shithole. Since the president said it, we might as well, all go for it. And of course, it's a way of really accusing and shaming Donald Trump for having used such vile language, kind of rubbing his nose in it.
Reminds me of training a dog.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So this idea that there is something disgusting about the idea of the shithole,
Yes.
and that Donald Trump seems to be giving people permission to tie this feeling of disgust to an entire nation. And on a deeper psychological level, it gives people permission to suddenly talk about something that evokes a feeling of disgust, a feeling of revulsion. But how can we translate that into a deeper psychological conversation?
Before we do that, I want to amp that up, that it's more than disgust, it's contempt. And I think that on TV and in journalism, using the word shithole all the time is a way of expressing contempt for Donald Trump's contempt of these other nations.
Right. So that's a way of almost trying to put this level of primitive feeling and language and behavior back into a container, to yoke it back into the role of being a president.
Yes.
And how disturbing it is to some people to think of the leader of the free world as somebody who can't keep their primitive language and maybe their primitive impulses in a proper contained place.
And of course, that brings up this idea that, shit sort of explodes out of Trump. Mm-hmm. I mean, he can't keep the shit contained.
Mm-hmm. Right. And bringing this back to Jungian analysis, that the capacity to keep your shit contained is the first part of this alchemical transformative process. And if the shit keeps breaking out in language and behavior, even in metaphors in that way, something doesn't change in the personality.
That's such a good point, Joseph, that let's expand a little bit on the idea of the containment of one's shit, or in Jungian terminology, shadow. Those things we don't like, don't want to see about ourselves. And shit is the perfect representation of that, a symbol for the stuff that is private, that we don't see. Children learn to be toilet trained, etc. Of the containment of our shadow is really important.
So I want to kind of jump in there and just back up for just a second for those of our listeners who maybe aren't versed in some of the terms. The shadow was one of Jung's really important ideas. And he said that it's what we learned, it's everything we don't want to be. And in the process of personal development, as you're growing up as a child, you learn from your parents, you learn from your teachers, you learn from the culture that there are certain things that are unacceptable. And that these are things that you learn to keep hidden, to, in some cases, sort of pretend that you don't even know about. So there's lots of things that this could apply to, but just as a little example, if it was considered really verboten in your family of origin to be greedy, and any time that you expressed any greed or avarice, you were shamed for it, that would get stuffed down and that would sort of be in your personal shadow. And a couple things around that. If you saw someone else being greedy, it might really, really bother you. And it's also true that in stuffing down the greed, you would be getting rid of a certain amount of important energy that you could then use later in life for psychological growth and development. So the thing about shadow is Jung said that 99% of the shadow is pure gold. And we can come back to that later. But that whatever gets stuffed down there probably has some really important implications for you personally.
Yes.
So, but yes, shit is a great, great metaphor for shadow. It's that which we learn to be ashamed about and keep private. And for the president to use this term to refer to countries like Haiti or African countries, which historically have been the recipient of projection of shadow material. I mean, I think we're right in that territory.
Right. So from a psychological perspective, the problem with Trump calling Haiti a shithole is that instead of taking a self-reflective process about his feelings of disgust or his feelings of inferiority or degradation as an internal psychological process, it's lifted out of him and it's landed outside of him imaginatively onto an entire nation, onto an entire people, an entire culture, and inviting our entire nation to join him in this collective projection of what is deficient inside of ourselves.
Absolutely.
And to the degree that we do that,
yes,
his internal work and the internal work of anybody else who joins in on the bandwagon is stalled. Yeah. And that's the real tragedy of this event.
So I'm going back to the idea of the container that you can have in an analytic container in your own personal process of you can have these feelings and then reflect on them of what is coming up in me, what does it mean, why do I feel this way, and that's a very different process from projecting them out there as if this country is characterized by such a term. So what we know is, where the shithole is not out there, it is in here, namely in Donald Trump, is he has shown us his own shadow.
So such an important idea. There was a very old, wise analyst I was talking to many, many years ago. I said, how do we orient towards somebody who says something incredibly provocative or something that really upsets us? And she really quietly turned inside and said, what somebody speaks about gives you information about the nature of their soul, not the nature of the thing that they're pointing to.
So if we were going to enter that, Joseph, what would we imagine about the psyche of Donald Trump based on the fact that he called Haiti a shithole? What is it we imagine about Haiti? And of course, it's just an imagination. It's our own projection in a way. And what does that tell us about?
Well, what we do know about Haiti, just to take Haiti and not try to encompass the whole African continent, but it is that it is economically poor. It has had a long and difficult history of oppression and exploitation. It was devastated by a hurricane, I'm going to say 5 years ago, give or take. And that countries such as Haiti are often called developing countries. And that's not a projection. I think this is just information, characteristics. And that Haiti is a struggling country.
So then we might imagine that this metaphor, that this very colorful metaphor that Trump used, would be maybe indicative of his own psychic poverty.
Yes.
Or his perhaps stunted level of personal development, if I may. Does that seem fair?
Yes, his own internal undeveloped country.
Yeah.
And some of the things we could imagine just from observing him, as we are forced to do constantly, is this undeveloped sense of compassion, perhaps an undeveloped sense of positive regard, an undeveloped sense of self-reflection, any number of things that still haven't blossomed in this personality.
And in particular, an undeveloped sense of empathy for places in the world where many people don't have a lot of the amenities that Americans take for granted, and certainly not the kind level of luxury that Donald Trump grew up with. No compassion.
Well, in some ways, we might imagine that this image of Haiti kind of compensates this inflated sort of Norwegian sensibility that he wants to associate with himself with on a conscious level. He wants to be seen as this sort of solar figure with all of this kind of opulence and gold and kind of Aryan almost, this sort of crown of orange hair. And of course, Haiti would be the compensating factor for that, which would bring everything that was missing from the conscious attitude.
So what would you be fantasizing that the internal image of Haiti could bring to him? So if we land that in a Jungian way, so somebody like Donald Trump comes in and he has a dream, and he says, and in this dream, I'm a citizen of Haiti. And I'm living this life as Haitians are currently living with all of the challenges that they have. What would we imagine saying or helping him with?
So in other words, you're asking sort of where is the prospective function of this image? Where is it heading, and what new growth would it be pointing toward?
Yeah, how would it help somebody to discover their inner third
Haiti
world country?
Right.
First of all, I imagine I was struck by your fantasy that there would be this kind of process, and wouldn't it be a real hallmark of something new if Donald Trump were to say, I had a dream about Haiti, and could talk about it, because it would then be located within him, and and that already would be huge.
And I think that we have to do that as a country now in this climate. We all have to sort of find our inner Trump and our inner Haiti,
Yes.
and use this time of terribly difficult polarization to do this kind of reflective work, and that in and of itself would be healing.
My fantasy, or the images that are evoked for me, is that in a world where there are so few resources, the community must be involved with itself.
Yes.
That things can't happen in isolation. That we need our neighbors. We need our friends to, dig out people out of the fallen refuse, after the hurricane comes by, that we can't stand alone. And I think that that's something that, if Trump were my client, that would be a powerful message, is that right now you live in a life where you feel or fantasize that everything is done by fiat, that you are alone, you are making these decrees, and this illusion of absolute autonomy. And a dream of being part of the Haitian community would be forcing you to admit that you are dependent on other people. You need other people, and consequently you have to treat other people as if they are valuable.
What I think you're pointing to is that there's much in the Haitian culture of a kind of wholeness, a relationship with community, with family, a connectedness to one another. So if Donald Trump could recognize his inner Haiti, there would be all of this there for him too. Such psychic riches.
And
So-
for us.
Yes.
As a country, I think we also need to see that. I think it's easy for us to see for us to do some projection and project our shadow on Trump, as it were, and to say he does this. But we do this as a culture. We project or we dump our shadow shit elsewhere and don't take responsibility for it and get curious about how it lives in us. So it's our job too.
So the real work that, if I can summarize, is to roll up our sleeves, to put your hands into the idea of the shithole, to not succumb to this conventional projection of disgust and diminishment, and to wade through it and find that what's on the other side of these denigrating comments is a fear of relating to something that is actually more rich on a soulful level than he is prepared to face.
Yes.
And that, because that's difficult for him, may even be frightening to him to have to face those qualities.
Yes.
And so it's distancing to degrade it.
Yes.
It's a defense mechanism.
Of course.
I'm interested, though, in Lisa's comment that, are we projecting and distancing, polarizing Donald Trump? And I'm aware that I have so much warmth of feeling toward Haiti, a culture that I know only very superficially. And I am lacking in a similar sense of relatedness to Donald Trump. So I'm aware that I'm doing some of the very thing we're talking about as we talk about it.
Absolutely. And this is a very polarized time, and in polarization there's a lot of projection that goes on. And so some part of our country listened to those shithole comments and thought, hell yeah, Haiti's a shithole. And that's one kind of projection. And another part of our country listened to those comments and thought, that guy is an asshole.
Yes.
And that's another kind of projection.
Yes.
So in some sense, the individual psychological task is to sit with all of that and try to find it within ourselves.
There really is deep psychological wisdom in the things that we claim are disgusting to us on first glance.
That's right.
And that's a large category. And this way of defending against an experience or another person or an image that somehow challenges our stance in the world, our habitual stance in the world, by claiming it's disgusting. And that attitude is thrown around a lot.
Right.
Whether it's the religious right finding gay people disgusting, which is a defense against having a rapport or a relationship with their gay neighbors. So it becomes an excuse for staying apart. For staying distant from.
And there are those, I just want to kind of keep bringing this back to a psychological way of looking at it, because there are those on the left who feel disgust for those on the right.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of happening in all kinds of ways. And if we orient to it psychologically, then we stay open always to I'm projecting something. What does that mean for me? What can I learn about it? Jung talked about, in difficult psychological times, the most important thing is for individuals to try to become more conscious. That's the thing that can make a difference. That's what he said.
So can we extend ourselves into a kind of relationship, compassion, understanding, non-polarized position with the bully, in this case, Donald Trump?
I think we have to try. I know it's hard, but we have to be curious about it, at least on a psychological level.
Yes, and that is a center point, I think, around all of our podcasts, this one and future ones, is that if we can have a deeper understanding of the phenomena that we're observing, whether it's a cultural phenomena or the idea of the shithole is almost kind of a media kind of phenomena, is to be able to take all of that and develop an internal attitude and a symbolic attitude to relate to it. And that's part of the process of making it useful to us.
That's perfect.
So let's make a shift.
So, as usual, we're going to take the last 10 or so minutes of the podcast and look at a dream. This was a dream that was shared with us by one of our listeners. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the dreamer and the dreamer situation. Then I will read the dream. We'll also put the text of the dream in the show notes. And then we're going to talk about it a little bit through a Jungian lens. So the dreamer is a male, 33 years old, recovering from a serious illness and in a phase of life where he's wondering what to do next. Okay, and here's the dream. I am in a flooded house. The house has 2 living rooms. Both are flooded. In one room is a television set with empty bird cages. The water has short-circuited the television set, and the bird cages have come alive with birds, including a dead bird my mom once had. Also, a previous cat that ran away is on my lap. In the other room are 2 other bird cages, one with a stick standing straight up, and the other with a baby crow inside. When I open the cage with the stick, the crow flies away and an open vista with a straight road opens up in front of me.
Where I often start with a dream when I'm listening to it with someone in the consulting room is, how does a dream just make me feel? What's my felt reaction to the dream? And this is a particularly moving dream of new life coming into being in the aftermath of the flood.
So to unpack that a little bit, so as you're listening to a dream, you're taking in the images of the dream, playing them out in your imagination, and then tracking what that does to you.
They are, for me, they are images that are loaded with affect, with feeling. And I want to pay attention to my own feeling, which obviously is coming from also the psyche of the dreamer, even this dreamer who I don't know and have never met, who just sent this dream in.
Yeah, that feeling connection that we have with somebody as they're telling the dream is part of the beginning of the unpacking of the message of the dream.
Yes.
Which is a central role to Jungian analysis. And there's an old Talmudic saying that a dream unanalyzed is like a letter unopened. So paying attention to our dreams on these various levels of feeling and meaning and metaphor all contribute to the discovery of the message. And one message that you're sensing is this message of hope.
Yeah.
In the letter.
Hope, enlivenment, flying, spirit, a road ahead.
Yeah, and I should say that one of the questions on this submission form was, what are the feelings in the dream? Because I don't think that we can really analyze a dream without knowing the dreamer's emotional response to the dream. And the emotions that this dreamer listed were surprise, mystery, and hope.
So you were tuning into that just in the beginning.
So after I have sort of had an initial sort of broad brush felt experience of the dream, I usually sort of take it from the top of where's the dreamer, what's the dream setting as Jung described it. He described dreams often as like a play where the dreamer is the playwright, the director, the set, and all the actors in the dream. So the beginning of the dream and the situation is important. A flooded house with 2 living rooms, both flooded, and a television set with empty bird cages.
Yeah, and one of the things about this opening setting for me is that there are 2 living rooms, which is actually quite an unusual thing. So I'm immediately interested in that. And that kind of gets doubled later because in one room, as we see, there are 2 bird cages. So there's some sort of doubling or opposition being set up. I'm not sure exactly how to unpack that, but it certainly caught my notice.
For me, I often feel that when something is repeated in a dream, it's as if the psyche is saying, make sure you don't miss this detail, don't gloss it over. And I'm struck by the word living room, that the place in the psyche where living can happen, livingness, and that it's flooded. So I often find myself being interested in both historical and mythologic events. And I'm always moved by the idea of the Nile flooding and receding, and how the whole delta maintains its fertility or its ability to be life-giving through this flooding of feeling, perhaps, or flooding of kind of life force. And at the time of the flood, particularly if we're not prepared for it, it can be devastating. Although if we understand that the psyche needs to flood at times, we can prepare for it as they would have done in the ancient world.
Right.
They would have
They knew
known
exactly when it was going to happen.
Yes, and welcoming it even.
And they knew that it would bring new fecundity.
Right, new life.
I thought of the flood of Noah and the ark, of the world being flooded entirely, and the lovely image of the ark with 2 of each kind of animal in it. And how do they know when land is about to appear? A bird.
A bird.
And so that's a kind of flooding that purifies, so that all the past is wiped away and something new can finally happen. And particularly the idea that old sins have been washed away. So that could be an interesting place to hold with this client. Is this person wishing or longing for some kind of a washing away of old sorrows or old guilts?
Well, I always think of dreams. Jung said at one point that dreams are a snapshot of something that has already happened in the unconscious. And my thought about the flood in this dream, and of course, we don't know, we don't have this dreamer here. If I were working with this dreamer, of course, I would check this and I would ask. I wouldn't just assume. So in some sense, what we're doing here is, pretty artificial. But I'm going to have an imagination that the flood may refer to the illness that we know that this dreamer is in the process of recovering from, and that something about the illness may have washed away an old mode of adaptation, may have dissolved psychic structures, and in that sense was experienced as quite catastrophic, as one would with a flood. But at the same time, it does create the potential for some sort of new orientation in life, or the growth of something new.
Well, and one of the things we know that's affected in the dream is the water short-circuited the television set. And, it's interesting because in our first section, we were talking about the kind of cultural storm about this language the president's using. But this idea that the television set is this kind of conversational megaphone where the collective culture is constantly shouting into the psyche, shouting into our living rooms. And following your idea, Lisa, that the way in which a serious illness will often take us away from all of that cultural concerns, or even imaginary concerns, fantasies of concerns.
Yeah.
The fact that when you're seriously ill,
Kind
do
of
you give a
throws you
darn?
back on yourself.
Do you give a damn
Yeah.
what this person's personality on television is saying? It's short-circuited.
And didn't you, the two of you, have the same feeling I did of when the TV was short-circuited, a kind of inner laughter of like, oh, that's
thank
great.
God. I
was A relief.
That's
That's
my
great.
iPhone.
Yeah, I'd like my TV to short-circuit so I just can't
Exactly.
be constantly overstimulated by everything that we're hearing in that way.
And of course it's interesting because one of the ways that I will sometimes work with images like this is this kind of when-then construction, which was actually developed by a Jungian analyst named Pat Berry. But she says that you can sort of imply causation when events follow each other in the dream. So it's like, let's see, what was the exact language? It's like when the flood short circuits the television, then the bird cages come alive.
Yes.
So something about the flood short-circuiting the television, kind of maybe what we're saying is perhaps the illness kind of quieting this, shutting down this sort of external voice. Then some new life arises.
And I think that is a real universal feeling. How many of us as parents are looking at our kids glued to their iPhones and wishing that they would short circuit, and having even an intuition that if this constant connection to electronic devices was short circuited, that something would come alive in our kids or come alive in a person who's glued into technology in that way.
Yes.
Right.
That when the external noise dies down, something more internal can arise, because the new life arises in the birdcage, a kind of container.
And then a previous cat that had run away returns. So not only are the birds resurrected, which is very profound, but something that had fled
Returns.
comes back.
And then the crow that appears toward the end of the dream is a baby crow.
A new life.
Again, new life, right.
So let's talk for a couple minutes about this sort of latter part of the dream with these two bird cages and this kind of unusual image of there's one bird cage with a stick standing straight up, and then in the other bird cage there's the baby crow, and somehow when the dreamer opens the first bird cage with the stick, then the baby crow is released. So what do you make of that?
Well, one of my associations when I was thinking about it is this archetypal symbol of the wand.
Oh, you mean like the stick standing straight up?
The stick
sort of like
being
the
like a wand. And all of us have seen these in like playing cards, for instance. And the idea of the wand in ancient times was that it somehow allowed a higher force to be drawn down into the wand and then reapplied in some kind of a magical effect in the material world.
So in some sense, the wand is like the relationship between the spiritual world and the mundane world.
Yes.
Like birds.
Yes.
Like birds, yeah.
And with getting a little intellectual, but Neumann's idea of the ego self-axis, that there is an idea of this connection between the above and the below.
Well, and that's an idea that's in shamanism in Mongolia. In Mongolia, the shamans climb up the tree, which is like the axis mundi, and that is how they access the spiritual world. So it's like this kind of verticality of it feels really important, maybe.
Absolutely. And somehow that image, opening the cage to that or letting the influence of the wand, of this above to below connection, then leads to something taking flight.
Yes. So we have a lot of images here of new life. There are birds in first empty bird cages, and then they come alive with birds. The cat comes back. There's the stick and a baby crow. And finally, there is an open vista with a straight road opening up in front of the dreamer. So there are lots and lots of images of new life. What do we imagine about what that new life could be? It's very tempting to say, oh, well, then perhaps the illness is really resolved and he's thinking about what to do next in life here on the planet. But what other kinds of life might be implied here?
Well, in Egyptian mythology, when someone would die, there were several aspects of the soul that were visualized, but one aspect of the soul would leave the body in the form of a bird. So
Yeah,
that's
a
sobering.
big image, yeah. Well, and also it's a crow, and I mean crows are sort of a pretty big symbol, but they definitely, I mean, they're a complex symbol, and they are related to creation, but they're also related to death and shadow. So yeah, there is something somber here, in spite of the fact that there's a lot about hope and a new vista. There's something sobering as well. And I would, to me, Deb, sort of an answer to your question, it feels like it's a little bit of a new spiritual orientation, perhaps.
Yeah. That we can't just concretize it and imagine that, as the fairy tales have it, he's going to live happily ever after. That's too simplistic.
Right, because we're thinking symbolically, not concretely. But if we think about it, as you were saying, that spiritually, that for the baby crow to fly off into the vista, it's also the concretization, perhaps, of the soul as something that can be imagined, and that's something that has motility and that has an independent will and a life. And that is a kind of spiritual rebirth.
Yes.
That the soul isn't just an abstraction.
Mm-hmm.
And I do believe that adversity, like a serious illness, can create and constellate a clarity about what is eternal,
Yes.
what is spiritual, and what still flies or moves through the inner worlds, despite the cage-like properties of a sick body.
Yeah. That seems like that might be a good place to leave it for today.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.